Nazi Germany began with one man and would end with one man, Adolf Hitler. In the beginning, from late 1939 to the early months of 1943, World War II seemed to favor the Germans. Under the direction of its dictator, Adolf Hitler, the Nazis had conquered most of Europe, including the regions of the Netherlands, the Balkans, Poland, Denmark, Norway, and France. After the overwhelming success of the Blitzkrieg military strategy, the Nazis soon began to spread their hatred and anti-Semitic views throughout Europe. It seemed that Hitler was invincible, and that the Allied powers had no chance of defeating this great monster. Adolf Hitler had rallied the people to his side, proving his point that the German people needed to rebuild and expand their country to provide Lebensraum, living space, for the new Aryan race. However, in the year 1943, more than 4 years after the war began, his vision of a 1,000-year Reich was crumbling. German cities were being bombed by British and American air forces, destroying civilian lives, devastating important transportation depots and rail tracks, and breaking the spirit of the war at home. Hitler's main European ally, Italy, had surrendered to the Allied forces, opening a new front for the German people to defend. German soldiers were dying on the Eastern Front at an accelerated rate, which led Hitler to recruit younger and inexperienced boys for the war effort, while the Soviets fiercely pushed the Nazis back, causing anger and devastation in the heart of Germany. Today, we will see in detail the absurdities that occurred in the final moments of the Third Reich's dictator. The Normandy landings, which would occur in the summer of 1944, brought panic to the eyes of the German people. Now they had to endure the destruction of war on both sides. Along with the shrinking of his empire, Hitler would also be dragged into an uncontrollable hole. The overall health of a fit, loud, and impressive world leader who had once conquered almost all of Europe by himself would rapidly decline. His grand ideas of the past would vanish before him as his enemies accelerated the destruction of his Nazi fate. His trusted generals would eventually lose faith in him, and his decisions would be viewed from all corners with suspicion and madness. His mood would change, fits of rage would erupt, and the great, determined, and courageous German leader of the past would be overcome by fatigue and despair. With defeat on the horizon, a fragile Hitler would soon plunge into a dark, gloomy abyss during the last 2 years and 5 months of his Great War, facing many periods of exhaustion, drug addictions, contracting diseases, and many crushing blows that would wound his heart and faith, all due to the rapid decline of his empire. And while he lost his psychological sanity, walking into the unknown and giving random and inexplicable attack orders, he unexpectedly dragged the innocent country he had grown to love and adore along with him. In the final months of World War II, Hitler's absolute and impulsive orders and his weak decisions to keep Germany alive were fueled by the mistakes he had made 3 years earlier. In the summer of 1941, the dictator decided to make the most important tactical move of the war and invade the Soviet Union in an operation that would be called Operation Barbarossa. After his failure to capture Britain, Hitler began to pursue his ambition to expand his empire eastward. This was a prime opportunity. He believed that the Soviets would succumb to the incisive Blitzkrieg attacks and deliver another quick victory to the Nazis. Hitler knew he would have to invade and march on Moscow quickly before the dreaded Russian winter set in. His closest advisors, including Albert Speer and Otto Ernst Remer, warned Hitler about the imminent future if the operation did not go as planned, due to the fact that he would be opening another front, thus splitting German supplies and soldiers who would now be needed in all corners of Europe. In his book, Hitler, A Study in Tyranny, historian Sir Alan Bullock elaborates on this ignorance by saying that Hitler was convinced that the war in the East would be over in 2 months, or 3 at most. He not only said this, but acted on it, refusing to make any preparations for a winter campaign. Hitler ignored everyone and went ahead with his plan. During the operation, Hitler was being drugged with vitamins and many other minerals and various pills to keep his body in balance. Many scientists said these drugs may have influenced the leader's decisions. The famous Nazi, who was the only one of his party to apologize to the victims of the mass genocide of the Holocaust, Albert Speer, recalled Hitler's unconscious decisions. Afterwards, strong Soviet forces broke through the positions of the Romanian divisions. Hitler initially tried to explain and minimize this disaster by making derogatory comments about the combat qualities of his allies. The Soviet troops soon began to overpower the German divisions as well. Hitler was very obstinate when it came to Barbarossa's plans. He made many excuses but did not commit to correcting previous mistakes. The operation did not go according to Hitler's grand plan. The German soldiers soon found themselves trapped in the snow, with little protection against the cold. Repeatedly informed by his generals that the German army could not advance further in the winter of 1941, Hitler continued to say that retreat was not an option. He was no longer listening to his generals' advice, which led to much confusion among government officials about how the war should be conducted and resulted in a chain of future defeats. The Eastern Campaign continued under pressure, and the German front began to collapse. In the early months of 1943, the Nazis and Hitler suffered a defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad. After 162 days of fighting, the Germans lost many experienced fighters who froze in the cold and died of pneumonia or were shot down by the Soviets. Hermann Göring, among some of Hitler's closest generals, who had been personally close to their leader in the beginning, now criticized Hitler for the poor choices he had made during the operation. European historian Ian Kershaw writes in his article that Hitler was extremely non-bureaucratic, kept himself distant from the daily business of government, and was not interested in complex matters of detail. Under the internal pressure from his staff and the external stress from the emotional public, who thought their leader was invincible, Hitler did not focus on the finer details of his plans, which led him to lose the Eastern Campaign. The Führer's personal secretary, Traudl Junge, in a 2001 interview, recalled how Stalingrad changed everything. In February 43, after Stalingrad, things were really quite different. The atmosphere in the Führer's headquarters was very oppressive. Junge recalled that no one in the bunker was allowed to talk about the war with the Führer. The Battle of Stalingrad is seen by many historians as the turning point of World War II. The German defeat in this battle triggered a series of events and other defeats for Germany. This was due to Hitler's unrealistic and stubborn plans to maintain control over his empire, even when the situation was desperate. As a result, Germany was slowly crushed and eventually fell into the hands of the Allies, while Hitler sank into a state of sadness and despair. Hitler's Nazi empire was attacked by another great wave of fighting in the summer of 1944, when the Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, France, in a major operation that would be called the D-Day invasions. Hitler had already planned and implemented the construction of an extensive defensive network of gun posts and many deadly obstacles on the beach, from the west coast of France to the beaches of Norway. This Atlantic Wall would defend the new German Empire from threats in the Atlantic Ocean, as Hitler once declared. Unfortunately, this protective wall was breached, and the invasion could have been avoided if Hitler had been aware of his surroundings. Historian R.G.L. Watte writes that, throughout his life, Hitler flirted with failure and unnecessarily involved himself in situations that posed danger to himself and his movement. If the dictator had focused more on the war effort, this Allied campaign could have been stopped. Many scientists and historians today predicted that the German leader could have had Parkinson's disease as early as 1943. Author and historian Sebastian Hafner observes about the early warning signs of the disease in Hitler. His hand could tremble, but the grip of that trembling hand was still, or again, sudden and deadly. This disease takes over the nervous system and paralyzes the brain. The tremors that Hitler suffered on the left side and the difficulty he had in walking suggest that these are signs that the dictator could have had Parkinson's during his lifetime. Parkinson's disease also makes the person unaware of what is really happening, because the brain is too weak to function at full capacity. When the Allied forces invaded the beaches of Normandy, Hitler, already in critical condition, saw the invasion only as a small distraction for a much larger invasion yet to come. Speer recorded that Hitler had predicted that the enemies would attack the port city of Pas-de-Calais. Hitler had 8 Panzer tank divisions in reserve and ready to be used on that fateful day in June 1944. In the end, however, because he believed only in his own theory and no longer listened to anyone, he decided to keep all but 2 of his reserves in the field. The attack on Calais did not happen, and when Hitler rose from his afternoon sleep, since his generals were not allowed to disturb him, the Allied forces had already taken the beaches and were marching through the fields of France. Dr. Leonard Heston reinforces that a symptomatic Parkinson's syndrome secondary to brain damage or some action of the myriad drugs Hitler was taking provides a plausible explanation for Hitler's Parkinsonian disorder. Parkinson's disease prevented the German leader from realizing that the D-Day invasions were as significant as they really were. His failures, and the mistake of letting the Celsius event pass without hesitation, or allowing his generals to give the defensive orders, led to the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany, led by a sick and absent-minded leader. Ashamed by the defeat on the beaches of Normandy and by the great defeat of the Russians at Stalingrad the previous year, Hitler began to see his closest generals less frequently. Speer noted that Hitler began to withdraw from the outside world and from reality. Instead of having lunch and dinner with his advisors, the dictator avoided talking about the war in his private life and had his meals with his secretaries in his private quarters. Younger remembers that Hitler was slowly isolating himself from his inner circle and spending more time alone or only with his lover, Eva Braun. She said in her interview that the Führer rarely saw any member of his military group outside of cabinet meetings after the Normandy landings in '44. We were not allowed to talk about the war with him during dinner or to have a cup of tea at night. All those operations were kept secret and out of our sight. Hitler did not want people to talk about the harsh effects of the war in his presence. According to Speer, he did not want people to tell him about the mistakes he had made that put Germany in the uncomfortable position of losing. As recalled by Rochus Misch, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's right-hand man, once said that this was because the presence of the old and exhausted Führer, whose country was being stripped of its foundations after defeats, would suggest to the German people that their leader was incapable of winning the war for them, after all. He writes the following: "Thus, it was Hitler who took the initiative for a world war that he could not win. In the end, as he had done so many times in his life, he ran away and hid, this time in his air raid shelter in Berlin. As his health slowly worsened, allowing Parkinson's disease to take over his body and impair his judgment and leadership, Hitler's poor choices influenced Germany's downward path toward destruction, while the dictator slowly began to distance himself from those closest to him and from the general public, keeping himself away out of pure shame and suspicion. In the spring of 1945, Hitler's physical health, hidden from the public, had rapidly declined. While he was still oblivious to the fact that his forces were losing on both fronts and had imaginary plans for a fierce Nazi comeback, the war seemed to be approaching a decisive end. As the Nazi Empire was crushed, Hitler also received the blows of mistakes, defeats, and stress, while his body slowly deteriorated and led him to the grave. While supplying Hitler's bunker in Berlin with food in the final months, SS Dr. Ernst Günther Schenk recalled that the 56-year-old dictator was a living corpse, a dead soul. His spine was hunched, his shoulder blades protruded from his bent back, and he hunched his shoulders like a turtle. I was looking into the eyes of death. Hitler no longer had the same outward expression he had displayed when he was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933. His physical posture was considerably different and shocking. Robert Payne notes in his book, the life and death of Adolf Hitler that Heinz Guderian, a German general who had succeeded in the Polish and Russian campaigns, visited Hitler shortly after Stalingrad and observed that he had lost his self-confidence. His speech had become hesitant, his walk had become a clumsy step, and his left hand trembled. The dictator had trouble walking. His knees were beginning to give way and weaken. Those closest to him, working in his bunker, including Speer, noticed that Hitler walked with a slow and hesitant step, like a man many years older. The dictator even had trouble catching his breath when staggering to events. He could not take a few steps without holding on to a railing, a wall, or even another person for support. Hitler also had problems with tremors, likely due to the great amount of stress he was under, which caused much suspicion among his closest advisors about how much longer their leader could remain in command of his beloved country. Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician, once noted in his diary that Patient A, Hitler, has been acting very strangely lately since the last time I saw him. His left arm has succumbed to tremors, and his left hand trembles uncontrollably. These tremors progressively worsened in January 1945, when Dr. Morell observed that Hitler had difficulty lifting his food to his mouth, and his uniform became stained. An assistant needed to pull up a chair for Hitler at every meal because his trembling hands made it impossible to carry out many daily tasks on his own. Hitler also had difficulty signing his name on important documents, and on many occasions, he had to use a rubber stamp to mark his signature. While reading documents, it was observed by Karl Dönitz, one of Germany's top naval commanders during the war, that the dictator needed a magnifying glass to see the small print, probably due to weakening vision. Junge recalls that Hitler had difficulty staying healthy due to his confinement in the Chancellery bunker in the final months and his inability to go outside because of Soviet artillery shelling. In her interview, she said that he had to deal with a very unhealthy life, very little fresh air and very little exercise. Hitler's refusal to exercise heavily, in addition to his unhealthy diet of sugars and sweets, according to Winifred Wagner, the German chancellor put at least 7 teaspoons of sugar in each cup of tea he drank, led to the downward spiral of his physical health. In the final months of power, Adolf Hitler's physical conditions rapidly declined, and the struggle to carry out daily routines in his offices and the difficulty in gaining the trust of his closest advisors, who saw him only as a shrunken figure under a cloud of suspicion, evolved into the final breaking point for the German national government and one of the greatest leaders of all time. Influenced by the disastrous defeats Germany was facing, Adolf Hitler's psychological health also quickly unraveled, with outbursts of rage becoming common inside the Führer's headquarters. In the last 2 years, the dictator had many burdens on his shoulders to control. Albert Speer would state in his memoirs that he noticed that Hitler wanted more control over his army as defeats became more frequent. This proved to be disastrous. Speer states that he regularly handled a huge daily workload, whereas in the past he was known for letting others work for him. Now he took on more and more responsibility for details. Hitler's generals sometimes bypassed their leader's plans because most of the time Hitler didn't know what he was talking about and was oblivious to actual situations. When the leader discovered these conspiracies, he would explode in fits of rage, which could last from a few minutes to several hours. Bullock writes in his biography, "The questioning of Hitler's assumptions or his facts shook him and threw him off balance. These fits of yelling and uncontrollable anger occurred more frequently as Nazi Germany reached its final days." Speer also mentioned Hitler's changing attitude. Overwork and isolation led to a peculiar state of petrification and rigor. He suffered from periods of mental torpor and was permanently caustic and irritable. Previously, he made decisions with almost sporty ease. Now, he had to force them out of his exhausted brain. Many from Hitler's inner circle, including Martin Bormann, the dictator's private secretary, remembered that everyone panicked during his fits of rage because most of the time, The outbursts were followed by someone's dismissal or execution. A few days before Germany's surrender, at the end of April 1945, and just hours after Dr. Morell had been dismissed, Hitler, with no one to personally administer his medications, finally announced that all hope was destroyed. After being informed by his closest advisors that no German reinforcements were coming to help Berlin in the city's final desperate attacks against the Soviets, Hitler exploded in fury. He proclaimed that all of Germany was lost due to the stupid mistakes of his generals. This was the final straw, and upon realizing that he could do nothing more for his country, Hitler gave up, finally proclaiming once and for all to all the people who still had faith in him that fate had drawn its rare line, and that Nazi Germany, along with its guide, would not rise from the ashes. Having too much stress on his plate, Hitler soon found himself overwhelmed with everything and lost all hope of getting back on the path to victory. He found himself living in an imaginary world where everything had to go his way. And when each plan in the end did not go as he wanted, his furious rage did not help to soothe the wounds of the country he had already caused, but instead worsened the situation and made it even more desperate. From the beginning of his reign as Chancellor of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler began taking many medications due to complications his body had. These doses increased significantly after 1943, when stress increased and the image of defeat was in the air. Theodor Gilbert Morell was Hitler's most famous doctor, who remained by the dictator's side during the years 1936 to 1945, during Hitler's early years. Since he did not want to show these critical conditions in public, Hitler began taking medications that Morell suspiciously delivered, which were necessary to suit his personal image. He once stated, "If I didn't have my faithful Morell, I would be completely knocked down." Morell not only cleared Hitler's eczema in the first year of his appointment, but also relieved the dictator's stomach cramps by giving him a combination of laxatives and painkillers. This method ended up being counterproductive, and Hitler would always be subject to future stomach pains, as his intestine was in a vicious cycle. The laxatives helped to clear his stomach, while the painkillers caused stomach contractions. The two drugs reacted against each other. To control stress and balance his emotions, Hitler continued to receive multiple injections and doses of medications from the doctor. When the war began to turn in favor of the Allied powers in 1944, Hitler began to increase the number of injections to about 20 daily injections, once declaring that injections were considered the proper medication for leaders. According to his diary, Dr. Morell strengthened the doses each time, giving his leader vitamins made from human feces, pheasant ears, chopped bull testicles, testosterone, cocaine, heart and liver extracts, methamphetamine toxins, as well as many other deadly ingredients, which Hitler soon became very fond of and dependent on. The German chancellor also received combinations of Mutaflor and Brom-Nervicite medications, with the former being used to cure his fatigue, while the latter liquid was injected into his body every night to put Hitler to sleep. Dr. Erwin Giesing, who was a close friend of Hitler, once commented, "Not that Hitler is a common addict, but his neuropathic constitution led him to find several pleasurable drugs." Throughout the war, Hitler became fascinated with the vitamin injections and pills he took, due to the fact that the chemicals inside them made him feel alert and awake. With the increasing stress from the idea of Nazi defeat, as well as the concealment of his own bodily problems, Hitler found pleasure in taking multiple combinations of drugs, but at the same time, he began to develop a series of dependencies that would take his body and mind on a new and disastrous journey. The regular injections and dosages of medications that Adolf Hitler received brought many dependencies and side effects. Even when the medications seemed to help Hitler in the short term, they eventually destroyed his body from the inside. The American military intelligence published a 47-page dossier during the war stating the following. Now, new research has revealed that Adolf Hitler was himself a regular user of the drug, methamphetamines, now a Class A, valued among addicts for its feeling of euphoria, but feared for its mental destructiveness. According to Morell's personal diary, the doctor gave Hitler 9 large-dose injections of this drug, crystal meth, after February 1945. Once the Chancellor began to realize that the Soviet army was camped outside the gates of his capital city, just a few hundred kilometers away. It was once reported that when the president of the Czech state, Dr. Emil Hácha, fainted in 1938 due to the repeated bullying that Hitler was doing to make him hand over Czechoslovakia to the Nazis, Dr. Morell was sent to treat the poor man. After giving Hácha one of Hitler's morning injections, the Czech leader immediately woke up and looked completely alert. The chemicals placed in these medications were rarely tested at that time. Some were considered inhumane to be administered to living organisms. The mixtures of these chemicals gave the dictator many long-term problems. According to the dossier, Hitler's heart began to suffer. Frequent headaches and dizziness were prominent, and his organs began to dehydrate, leading to digestive problems, all due to the drugs he was consuming. Hitler began to gain weight and became very lethargic and lazy, which affected his willingness to move and act quickly as he did before. Along with his contraction of Parkinson's disease, Hitler's body slowly disintegrated. Historian David Irving writes, "Despite the agonizing pains and moments of fainting and nausea, which he never mentioned to anyone, even when asked, he, Hitler, maintained a firm posture and faced everything with determination and iron energy." The drugs Hitler was receiving only lasted for short periods of time, and the substances slowly ruined his body until death. Hitler would continue to work with Dr. Morell until the bitter end in April 1945. In his book, Robert Payne also states that respectable doctors considered him, Dr. Morell, totally inept. However, Hitler trusted him, confided in him, listened to his long explanations about the actions of the drugs on the nervous system, and considered him the greatest of all German doctors. Hitler would also continue to lead the nation, even when he was not in his best condition. Dr. Morell would inject more than 60 different combinations of drugs and different vitamins into the Führer's body over his 9 years in office. He would test many of the drugs for the first time on Hitler. Hitler's dependencies would not only become more prominent in his life as the war progressed, but also had some harmful effects on his body, such as deforming his external features and leading him to decline faster than anyone could expect, which in turn changed his attitude toward the war and brought the gradual downfall of his beloved creation. Adolf Hitler's vision of creating a 1,000-year empire was destroyed in a few years of horrible mistakes, poor judgments, failing health, and confusing orders. To appear his best at each event, and wanting to represent the model of an Aryan man, Hitler involved himself in illegal injections and daily doses of mixed drugs for several years, which fueled his dependencies, inflamed his fits of rage and temper problems, and brought about a series of unconscious visions in which the Führer could not and would not see the destruction that was happening in his country. He still continued to fight for the impossible future. Fueled by his drug dependencies, the mistakes he made during the Battle of Stalingrad and the D-Day invasions would haunt him later, while the citizens of once invincible Germany soon found themselves homeless, being targeted, raped, starving, desperate, and being demolished by the overwhelming Allied forces. The dictator's generals would continue to look at their leader with suspicion and anger in the last 2 years, thinking that their once outgoing dictator had lost his intelligence, which quickly led to Hitler's isolation from his closest friends and the public. With no public appearances of their beloved leader, all hope in Germany was suddenly lost, while many loyal Germans lost faith in their cause and gave up in all circles of life, promoting a faster dissolution of the Nazi Empire. By the end of 1944, both the Red Army and the Western Allies were advancing into Germany. Recognizing the strength and determination of the Red Army, Hitler decided to use his remaining mobile reserves against the American and British armies, which he perceived as much weaker. On December 16th, he launched the Ardennes Offensive to incite disunity among the Western Allies and perhaps convince them to join his fight against the Soviets. After some temporary successes, the offensive failed. With much of Germany in ruins in January 1945, Hitler spoke on the radio. "No matter how grave the crisis may be at this moment, it will, despite everything, be overcome by our unshakable will." Acting on his view that Germany's military failures meant it had lost the right to survive as a nation, Hitler ordered the destruction of all German industrial infrastructure before it could fall into Allied hands. The armaments minister, Albert Speer, was charged with executing this scorched earth policy, but he secretly disobeyed the order. On a cold afternoon in late March 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in his headquarters in Reims, northeastern France, and drafted an unprecedented and historic cable. It was sent to Moscow for the personal attention of Joseph Stalin. This was the first time in all the years of war that the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force communicated directly with the Soviet leader, but now there were urgent and pressing reasons to do so. The final Allied thrust into Germany was about to begin, and it was clearly important that the Anglo-American armies coordinate their movements with the Russians. Eisenhower told Stalin his plans and asked for reciprocity, wanting to avoid a repeat of the situation in 1939. Then, at a very different phase of hostilities, German and Russian troops, allied by treaty, confronted each other in Poland when that country was being divided between Stalin and Hitler. No pre-arranged demarcation line had been fixed, which resulted in a battle with surprisingly heavy casualties on both sides. In the climate of suspicion that was developing between America and Britain, on the one hand, and Russia, on the other, such a confrontation had to be avoided at all costs. It could bring catastrophe at this vital stage of the war. Eisenhower sent 2 other cables that afternoon, one to Washington to General of the Army George C. Marshall, who was his immediate superior. The other was to General Bernard Montgomery, Commander-in-Chief of the 21st Army Group in northern Germany. To both men, Eisenhower outlined his new plan to bring a quick end to the war. It focused on the 12th Army Group, under the command of General Omar N. Bradley, which would advance through central Germany on the Erfurt-Leipzig-Dresden axis. There, Eisenhower hoped he would meet the Russians and split Germany in 2. Within a few hours, the telegrams, especially the one sent to Stalin, created the most serious division between Americans and Britons since the beginning of the invasion 9 months earlier on D-Day, June 6, 1944. In the days and weeks prior to March 28th, Eisenhower had decisively changed his mind on a vital issue related to the course of the war. He no longer considered Berlin, the capital of Hitler's Reich, an important military objective. Unlike the British generals, Eisenhower had not been trained to consider political objectives as part of military strategy. His main concern was to end the war as quickly as possible and with the fewest casualties. In international terms, Eisenhower was politically inexperienced. His mission, as defined by the combined chiefs of staff, was clear. You will enter the European continent and, in conjunction with the other United Nations, undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of its armed forces. Even at this late stage of the war, his objective was purely military, to destroy the enemy army as quickly as possible. In any case, it had already been agreed at higher levels that Berlin would fall under Soviet control. For the British in general, and for Prime Minister Winston Churchill in particular, the shape of the post-war world was already clear. Like Czechoslovakia and Poland, much of Eastern Europe was already under Russian control, destined for communist rule. If Montgomery could capture Berlin before the Russians, it would be a great propaganda victory and would give the Western Allies an important advantage in future negotiations. Churchill had already noted with apprehension the changes in Stalin's behavior since the conference between him, Stalin, and Roosevelt in Yalta in February 1945, where the map of the post-1945 world had been sketched. For example, Anglo-American bombers forced to land behind Russian lines were being interned, along with their crews, The Russians had refused to evacuate Anglo-American soldiers in eastern camps, although reciprocal arrangements were being made for Russian soldiers in western camps. Air bases and refueling and repair facilities for American bombers in territory controlled by the Russians were being denied. In these early circumstances of the Cold War, Churchill considered Eisenhower's telegram to Stalin a naive and dangerous interference in global political strategy. He was furious. There were several reasons, good and bad, for Eisenhower's change of opinion about Berlin. He deeply detested Montgomery, who was in command in the north. Deciding for a push on Berlin would give the British Field Marshal a larger role than Eisenhower could tolerate. On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt died at his home in Warm Springs, Georgia. Upon hearing the news, the German hierarchy celebrated, with Joseph Goebbels commenting, "This is the turning point." The following day, Hitler himself would have reassured his nation's battered troops on the Eastern Front, guaranteeing that relief was imminent. Berlin, he assured, would remain German, and Vienna, which the Russians had taken that very day, would soon be part of the homeland again. In reality, however, this perfectly illustrated the illusion with which the war effort continued to be maintained by the Nazi high command. In fact, only in the last 24 hours, American troops had captured 2 heavy water plants in Stadtilm on the Ilm River, eliminating any chance of the Germans developing an atomic bomb in the immediate months ahead. 2 days later, on April 15th, the German army launched a counterattack against the Americans near Uelzen in an effort to link up with their compatriots in the battle for Berlin. The operation failed, and the Americans, who revealingly named the battle Operation Kaput, repelled Hitler's army with a brutal combination of artillery, tanks, and phosphorus weapons. The end of World War II was near, and thus began the final days of the Nazis. In the early hours of the following day, April 16, 1945, the message was delivered clearly. At 3 a.m., the Soviets launched their offensive against Berlin with no less than 20 armies, 2.5 million soldiers, and 40,000 mortars and field guns. Hitler's position was desperate, and now, finally, he realized it. On April 20th, his 56th and final birthday, Hitler made his last trip from the Führerbunker to the surface. In the ruined garden of the Reich Chancellery, he awarded Iron Crosses to teenage soldiers of the Hitler Youth who were now fighting the Red Army on the front line near Berlin. On April 21st, Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front broke through General Gotthard Heinrich's Army Group Vistula defenses during the Battle of the Silo Heights and advanced to the outskirts of Berlin. In denial about the desperate situation, Hitler placed his hopes on the under-equipped and undermanned Armeeabteilung Steiner, Army Detachment Steiner, commanded by Felix Steiner. Hitler ordered Steiner to attack the northern flank of the salient, while the 9th German Army was ordered to attack northward in a pincer attack. During a military conference on April 22nd, Hitler asked about Steiner's offensive. He was informed that the attack had not been launched and that the Soviets had entered Berlin. Hitler ordered everyone, except Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, Hans Krebs, and Wilhelm Burgdorf, to leave the room, then launched a verbal attack against the supposed treason and incompetence of his generals, culminating in his declaration, for the first time, that all is lost. He announced that he would remain in Berlin until the end, and then commit suicide. On April 23rd, the Red Army had encircled Berlin, and Goebbels made a proclamation urging its citizens to defend the city. On that same day, Göring sent a telegram from Berchtesgaden, arguing that since Hitler was isolated in Berlin, Göring should assume leadership of Germany. Göring set a deadline after which he would consider Hitler incapacitated. Hitler responded by ordering Göring's arrest, and in his last will on April 29th, he removed Göring from all government positions. On April 28th, Hitler discovered that Himmler, who had left Berlin on April 20th, was trying to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies. He considered this a betrayal and ordered Himmler's arrest. He also ordered the execution of Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's SS representative at Hitler's headquarters in Berlin, for desertion. Hitler's last words. On the night of April 28th, Adolf Hitler had much on his mind. News had arrived during the day that a revolt had taken place in northern Italy. Benito Mussolini had been captured by the partisans. Armistice negotiations were being initiated by some of Hitler's military commanders in Italy, and there had been an attempted coup in Munich. The Russian forces were only about 900 meters from the bunker, and the 9th German Army, which had been ordered to break the Russian siege of the Reich capital to rescue Hitler, would likely be unable to accomplish its mission. Even so, Hitler had a slight hope that General Walter Wenck's 12th Army, on its way to Potsdam and Berlin, might succeed. However, Hitler knew that he would soon have to commit suicide. Before doing so, he wished to marry his longtime lover, Eva Braun, and to write his final political testament and his personal testament. On April 29th, with the Russians less than 24 hours away from securing full control of Berlin, Hitler ordered that his German shepherd, Blondie, be poisoned. The idea of his beloved companion falling into Russian hands was unbearable, but it was also important to test the effectiveness of the cyanide capsules that had been distributed in the bunker. After consumption, Blondie died instantly. Her 5 puppies were also shot. At 5 a.m. on April 30th, the bunker's residents were awakened by artillery fire. Within an hour, Hitler, who was sitting with tired eyes, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, was informed that they were only a few hours from defeat. Around 2 p.m., Hitler had his last meal. "The time has come," he said as he stood up. "It's all over." Goebbels, who had long insisted that Hitler remain in Berlin, now tried to convince his Führer to leave the city. Hitler refused before bidding him farewell. Hitler and his secretary, Junge, went to the small conference room near Hitler's quarters. She was about to remove the cover from the typewriter, as Hitler usually dictated directly to the machine, when he said, "Take it down on the shorthand pad." She sat alone at the large table and waited. Hitler was in his usual place, at the wide side of the table, resting both hands on it and looking at the empty top of the table, which that day wasn't covered with maps. For several seconds, Hitler said nothing. Then, suddenly, he began to speak the first words, "My political testament." After finishing his political testament, according to Junge, Hitler paused briefly and then began to dictate his personal testament. Hitler's personal testament was shorter. He explained his marriage, disposed of his property, and announced his imminent death. The dictatorship was concluded. Hitler made no corrections to any of the documents. He moved away from the table on which he had been leaning the entire time and said, "Type this for me immediately in 3 copies, and then bring them to me." Junge felt that there was something urgent in his voice and thought about the most important, most crucial document written by Hitler going out into the world without any correction or careful revision. She knew that every birthday congratulation letter for some Gauleiter, artist, etc. was polished, improved, revised, but now Hitler had no time for any of that. The party continues while the Russians approach Hitler, left his wedding party 3 times to ask Junge how the typing was going. According to Junge, Hitler would look and say, "Are you ready?" And she would reply, "No, my Führer, I am not ready yet." Bormann and Goebbels also kept coming to see if she had finished. These comings and goings made Junge nervous and delayed the process, increasing her anguish about the whole situation, and she made several typing mistakes. Her task was also complicated by the need to add to the political testament the names of some appointments for the new government under Admiral Karl Dönitz. During the wedding party, Hitler discussed and negotiated the matter with Bormann and Goebbels. While Junge typed the clean copies of the political testament from her shorthand notes, Goebbels or Bormann would alternately come in to give her the names of the ministers of the future government, a process that lasted until she finished typing. Around 5 a.m., Junge typed the last of the 3 copies of each of the political and personal testaments. Around 6 a.m., on April 29th, Russian artillery began its regular heavy bombardment of the government district and the area around the Reich Chancellery. The front line was now about 400 meters from the chancellery. During those early morning hours, Hitler planned for the 3 copies of his personal and political testaments to be taken out of Berlin and delivered to Admiral Dönitz and Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner, commander of Army Group Center in Bohemia. 3 messengers departed from Berlin to cross enemy lines, each carrying a copy of the political and personal testaments. Short pause. Hitler commits suicide. Allies capture documents. The Russian assault was relentlessly approaching the bunker. Around 9 a.m., artillery fire suddenly stopped, and messengers reported to the bunker that the Russians were advancing with tanks and infantry. It became quiet in the bunker, and there was great tension among its occupants. Later that morning, Junge returned to Hitler's bunker. She noticed that Hitler was restless and pacing from room to room. Hitler told her that he would wait until the messengers had reached their destinations with the testaments and then take his own life. That afternoon, Hitler was informed that Mussolini had been executed by the Italian resistance movement the previous day. It is believed that this increased his determination to avoid capture. On April 30th, Soviet troops were 500 meters from the Reich Chancellery when Hitler shot himself in the head and Braun bit into a cyanide capsule. According to Hitler's wishes, their bodies were carried to the garden behind the Reich Chancellery, where they were placed in a bomb crater, doused with gasoline, and burned while the Red Army's shelling continued. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz and Goebbels assumed Hitler's roles as head of state and chancellor, respectively. On the night of May 1st, Goebbels and his wife, Magda, committed suicide in the Reich Chancellery garden after poisoning their 6 children with cyanide. Berlin surrendered on May 2nd. The remains of the Goebbels family, General Hans Krebs, who had committed suicide that day, and Hitler's dog, Blondie, were repeatedly buried and exhumed by the Soviets. The remains of Hitler and Braun were also said to have been moved, but this is likely Soviet disinformation. There is no evidence that any identifiable remains of Hitler or Braun, with the exception of dental bridges, were found by them. While news of Hitler's death spread quickly, a death certificate was only issued in 1956 after a long investigation to collect testimonies from 42 witnesses. Hitler's death was recorded as a presumption of death based on these testimonies. At 10:26 p.m. on May 1st, Dönitz, via Hamburg radio, announced Hitler's death and his own succession. Hitler ruled the Nazi Party autocratically, asserting the Führerprinzip, leader principle. The principle was based on absolute obedience of all subordinates to their superiors. Thus, he viewed the structure of government as a pyramid, with himself, the infallible leader, at the apex. The hierarchy in the party was not determined by elections. Positions were filled by appointment from those in higher positions who demanded unquestionable obedience to the leader's will. Hitler's leadership style consisted of giving contradictory orders to his subordinates and placing them in positions where their duties and responsibilities overlapped with those of others, so that the strongest would do the work. In this way, Hitler fostered distrust, competition, and disputes among his subordinates to consolidate and maximize his own power. His cabinet never met after 1938, and he discouraged his ministers from meeting independently. Hitler typically did not give written orders. Instead, he communicated them verbally or transmitted them through his close associate, Martin Bormann. He entrusted Bormann with his paperwork, appointments, and personal finances. Bormann used his position to control the flow of information and access to Hitler. Hitler dominated his country's war effort during World War II to a greater extent than any other national leader. He strengthened his control over the armed forces in 1938 and subsequently made all major decisions regarding Germany's military strategy. His decision to mount a risky series of offensives against Norway, France, and the Netherlands in 1940, against the advice of the military, proved successful, although the diplomatic and military strategies he employed in attempts to force the United Kingdom out of the war failed. Hitler deepened his involvement in the war effort by appointing himself commander-in-chief of the army in December 1941. From that point on, he personally directed the war against the Soviet Union, while his military commanders facing the Western Allies maintained a degree of autonomy. Hitler's leadership became increasingly disconnected from reality as the war turned against Germany, with defensive military strategies often hampered by his slow decision-making and frequent directives to hold unsustainable positions. In the final months of the war, Hitler refused to consider peace negotiations, preferring the destruction of Germany to surrender. The military did not challenge Hitler's control over the war effort, and senior officers generally supported and implemented his decisions. Almost 70 years after Adolf Hitler's death, it remains difficult to succinctly assess the impact of his life and reign. However, there is little doubt that Hitler's vision did not include civilized or humanitarian ideas. This contrasted with previous powers that once ruled the world. From the Roman Empire to the British, there was always some form of ideology referencing a better, brighter, and more peaceful future. These ideals simply did not align with Hitler's thirst for power. Instead, Hitler pursued a policy of suppression, slavery, and racial cleansing, the results of which represent one of the saddest, most depraved, and horrific chapters in human history. Yet, in Hitler's eyes, the war was exclusively the fault of Jewish statesmen or those working for Jewish interests. Even in the end, he commented, "The Jews are the true culprits in this murderous struggle," before continuing, "This time the real culprits would have to pay for their guilt, although by more humane means than war." These humane means were the gas chambers. Moreover, it was his efforts to justify his thesis that are particularly distorted. Drawing on Darwin's survival of the fittest, Hitler commented in 1942, "Monkeys kill any member of their community who shows the desire to live separately. And what applies to monkeys applies to men too, on a higher level." It is also clear that Hitler knew very well that he had set in motion a series of irreversible events. His policies and decisions, as well as those of his closest confidants, had ensured that all bridges with the rest of the world were burned. Alarmingly, it is generally accepted that Hitler viewed the terrible shockwaves he had created as a positive achievement. The terrible consequences did not matter. The writer John Mearsheimer argued the following: "War is the most controversial strategy that great powers can employ to increase their share of world power." A former Bohemian corporal and later self-proclaimed Führer employed this strategy in the pursuit of maximizing power and becoming a regional hegemon. However, waging wars on multiple geographically distant fronts with minimal communications resulted in strategic overstretch. Mearsheimer also stated that wars are won by big battalions, not by air or sea fleets. The strongest power is the state with the strongest army. In retrospect, it can be said that Hitler maintained considerable land power and the Wehrmacht infantry was mechanized. Its armor had considerable mobility and carried lethal firepower, and its artillery was mobile. To further strengthen the land component, it is notable that the Waffen-SS fought alongside the Wehrmacht, and the SS Totenkopf, Death's Head Division, was primarily tasked with suppressing resistance and insurgency in the occupied territories. In these operations, the SS Totenkopf committed heinous crimes against humanity, including massacres and ethnic cleansing. The crimes were later extended to prisoners of war, POWs, and in December 1944, Sepp Dietrich of the Waffen-SS led the executions of American prisoners of war, known as the Malmedy Massacre. It is pertinent that the violent atrocities committed by the Nazi war machine triggered a massive opposing force that offered resistance. This resistance eternally existed within the ranks of the Nazi hierarchy. The infamous July 1944 Operation Valkyrie can be taken as an exemplary example when high-ranking officers unsuccessfully tried to overthrow Hitler. The intentions of the plotters remain a debatable topic. However, it resulted in mass executions and forced suicides, including Field Marshal Rommel. Short pause. It is worth mentioning that Nazi Germany achieved geopolitical gains, but failed to articulate and employ a culminating point of attack, CPA, and a culminating point of victory, CPV, in its war effort and overall doctrine. For example, the Prussian army under Wilhelm I and Otto von Bismarck captured Paris and defeated France during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71. However, after displaying military prowess and achieving geopolitical gains, including the annexation of Alsace and Lorraine, the Prussians sought peace. The annexation of territories for geopolitical gains is a useful strategy for great powers. However, conquests and occupations of entire countries generate insurgencies and armed resistance movements. Arguably, Hitler chose such allies and formed alliances with nations that could not provide much assistance to Germany and ultimately became a liability. For example, Japan was not even on Germany's continental axis and had little or no strategic value. Likewise, Mussolini attacked Albania on April 7, 1939, and subsequently invaded Greece on October 28, 1940. The news of these attacks was shocking to Hitler, as he was neither consulted nor informed about these Italian actions. For his pursuit of power maximization, while honoring the moral obligations of fulfilling the pacts with Italy, Hitler offered military assistance to Mussolini. The Duce refused the Führer's offer, but ultimately, the Italian forces became bogged down and were rescued by the German forces. The Italian dictator Mussolini failed to effectively fight the Allied forces and was deposed by King Victor Emmanuel III. In this sense, Mearsheimer rightly said that alliances are only temporary marriages of convenience. However, the experience gained from this conjugal relationship largely allows for the choice of better partners in the future. How could a bachelor know or have the slightest idea of the usefulness of a marriage, or even a marriage of convenience? Perhaps it was correctly observed that good judgment comes from experience, but much of it comes from bad judgment. In general, states do not make good or bad judgments. They only opt for the most appropriate and circumstantial choice. However, Hitler acted contrariwise, not only helping his allies, but in this pursuit, also endangering the very existence of his armed forces. In retrospect, his allies, including Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Croatia, had no strategic usefulness. The realist tradition encourages a state to rely on its own muscles, mobilizing and building its resources to ensure its survival. If a state fails to do this, then, inherently, it resorts to external balancing, entering into coalitions and alliances. The latter serves as a useful strategy to balance the threat. However, the ultimate objective is survival. Hitler led Germany into alliances that were neither a structural requirement nor a strategic necessity, and ultimately resulted in the strategic overstretch of the armed forces. For example, Japan had little strategic value, and its attack on the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, dragged Germany into declaring war on the U.S. 4 days later, on December 11, 1941. Despite the fact that the German Navy carefully conducted its unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic without targeting American vessels, the German armed forces seemed to be constantly rescuing their allies. Kriegsmarine submarines even reached Indonesia to provide fire support to the Imperial Japanese forces. Timeliness has great value in conducting military operations, and Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway in a timely manner to secure the supply of iron ore from Sweden. Strategically, both states had enormous value in maximizing his power. However, Hitler made a grave mistake in underestimating the Soviets. He neglected the fact that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was to his benefit, and provided him with a secure East. When Germany acted as an irrational actor, the system punished it, and Hitler met a bitter end, having no choice but to commit suicide on April 30th, 1945, with his thousand-year Reich sinking into the abyss of darkness. The German chancellor, who became an absolute ruler, was not rational in choosing his allies. Had the dictator acted as a true realist and not declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, to please the Empire of Japan, since declaring war on the US was not in his interest, he might have had a better ending. This ultimately resulted in the US's gain and Germany's loss at the strategic level. Hitler made a grave mistake by sending his troops to Libya to aid the Italian forces. He repeated the same mistake on several occasions. The Africa Corps, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was a unique expeditionary force of that era. They were always busy rescuing the Italian forces, as the Italians were unable to resolve their own problems. They created the mess that the German forces had to clean up. Aspiring powers tend to become regional hegemons. Mearsheimer observed that once a state achieves this exalted position, it becomes a status quo power. From 1933 to 1945, Germany remained a revisionist state and aspired to achieve regional hegemony. However, in September 1938, the Munich Peace Agreement was taken as an indicator by then British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain that Germany was becoming a status quo power, which led the PM to say that we have achieved peace in our time. In retrospect, Chamberlain resorted to the strategy of appeasement when dealing with a revisionist yet overly aggressive Germany. At the cost of seeming to speak nonsense, I tell you that the National Socialist movement will continue for 1,000 years. Do not forget how they laughed at me 15 years ago when I declared that one day I would rule Germany. They laugh now just as foolishly when I declare that I will remain in power. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.